Hi everyone, welcome to the case studies session on environmental issues brought to you by Sunya IAS in its ethics course. A few things that you should keep in mind about case studies on environmental issues. Use the knowledge that you have already gained in studying for prelims or mains for GS paper 3. You do not need to duplicate the material. The issues would be on environmental pollution, not following the environmental norms or the laws in the country, and maybe overlooking the waste management solutions or causing harm to the biodiversity of a particular area while constructing a particular project. So these are things that you have already studied for your general studies paper, and you would have basic facts already in your knowledge which you can use to solve these particular case studies. So please don't duplicate any material. And remember that in these case studies, you will have to focus on implications or consequences of environmental issues. And you don't need to explain how the particular environmental phenomenon is happening, right? So here the focus will be on what are the solutions that you can take now that the problem has occurred, or how do you approach a particular solution should someone be punished for making environmental degradation happen, or what are the causes of environmental issues, and not really the technical aspect of it, or the how a particular pollutant or chemical is affecting the environment. You don't need to explain that. It's only about the causes and effects. So please stay away from technical jargon, but do use words that reflect domain knowledge. For instance, please do not quote any technical term which is not mentioned in the case study, right? So don't mention any jargons. But if asked for solutions, you can mention things like climate engineering or carbon sequestration, but only if it is relevant to the question at hand. If you have been asked to suggest some solutions or suggest some things that you will do to um, rectify the problem at hand, then in the long-term solutions, maybe you can write that we can look forward to carbon sequestration or using some technology to solve this particular environmental problem. For instance, if it is about the air pollution, then you can say that we might use smog towers or air purifiers and make them available to different areas so that this problem can be taken care of, right? Moving on. So now we will solve a case study, which is question 4 of section B of 2018 GS4 paper. So the question is that a big corporate house is engaged in manufacturing industrial chemicals on a large scale. It proposes to set up an additional unit. Many states rejected its proposal due to detrimental effect on the environment. But one state government acceded to the request and permitted the unit close to a city, brushing aside all opposition. The unit was set up 10 years ago and was in full swing till recently. The pollution caused by the industrial effluents was affecting the land, water, and crops in the area. It was also causing serious health problems to human beings and animals. This gave rise to a series of agitations demanding the closure of the plant. In a recent agitation, thousands of people took part, creating a law and order problem necessitating stern police action. So, following the public outcry, the state government has ordered the closure of the factory. The closure of the factory has resulted in the employment of not only those workers who were engaged in the factory, but also those who are working in the ancillary units. It's also very badly affected those industries which depended on the chemicals manufactured by it. So, as a senior officer entrusted with the responsibility of handling this issue, how are you going to address it? So, this is the case study, and what you should be doing is pause this video, go through the case study once again, and please note down key facts that you feel are important and will help you in answering the particular question of how you are going to address it. Think on this, brainstorm about a particular solution, and then once you are done, resume watching the video and we'll solve this together. Okay, so the analysis is that this is a corporate house. So the moment it says corporate house and it is an environmental case study, you should know that there's a corporate social responsibility of all the corporations, and the corporates are supposed to or are expected to follow certain environmental norms, certain social norms, so that they don't have negative impacts on the society in which they are operating. Secondly, the nature of business is manufacturing industrial chemicals, which is inherently polluting, right? So the third thing is that this manufacturing is large scale, which means it will have wide-ranging impacts on the places that it operates in. Fourth thing, it is setting up one additional unit, which means that an environmental impact assessment, which you would have read about it in your GS3 paper, should be done before allowing such a polluting unit to be set up in any particular place. Fifth point is that it has a detrimental effect on the environment, right? Which we've already discussed, that its nature of business is manufacturing industrial chemicals, which inherently by its own nature is polluting. And now that you know that it has a detrimental effect on the environment, what are the follow-up actions that the company can take to minimize this adverse impact, right? So if the company knows that it will have to discard some liquid chemicals, right? So what can it do instead of just discharging the effluents into the river? What can it do? How can it take care of these environmental pollutants and address that before releasing it to the environment, right? One state government has permitted to set up the unit. A lot of other state governments refuse. So were the regulations followed in this case or not is one good question that you need to investigate about. Then in the operation for the last 10 years, it has been working, it has been operational. So you should review the working of the last 10 years to see whether there were any problems or any environmental impacts of the same, and why this issue has come up only after 10 years and what is the reason behind all of this. So next thing is that the pollution caused by industrial effluents is affecting the land, water and crops, which means that there is adverse impact on ecosystem health. You might want to undertake a study on quantifying or researching the impacts on the ecosystem that have happened as a result of these effluents being released. Serious health issues to human beings and animals, which means the social impact assessment, what has been the effect on the population which has been living close by. Next, there are agitations which have been demanding closure, and there was a law and order problem and police action had to be taken for crowd control, right? And public outcry, which means the state government ordered closure of factory. So was the action proportionate to the damage? Uh, why has the state government ordered closure of the factory? So like you need to inquire all this. And let's say this was an accidental leakage, but the company did not mean to intentionally do this, right? So you will take a different approach to penalty and recovery and restoration of ecosystem health as compared to a company which has deliberately damaged the environment without care for the effects on its surroundings, right? So you need to ensure that whatever action is being taken is proportionate to the problem that has occurred. Next point is unemployment of those working in the factory and ancillary units. These are the second order effects. So the consequences of shutting down the factory You need to take care of these also. And finally, adverse effect on industries dependent on the chemicals manufactured by it, which means there are negative externalities that have happened due to an event occurring in one particular industry, and so many other industries which are dependent on it are suffering, right? So you need to take all of this into account while framing your answer. So coming to the question, how are you going to address it? So the first thing that you should be doing is that the particular unit for which protests are taking place, you should inquire into how that unit was set up, because as mentioned in the case study, only one state allowed setting up of that unit, right? So you should first undertake an investigation to find out if all the compliances and regulations were followed for setting up that unit, right? So first I will undertake an inquiry into the permission granted for setting up of the additional unit. So you will check were all the legal provisions followed, were regulatory compliances in place, any environmental impact assessments taken, because in the case study itself it is mentioned that it is a polluting industry. So environmental impact assessment would have to be undertaken for the same, right? And were there any social impact assessments done? What will be the impact on people living nearby near the additional unit, right? Secondly, if in case in the above investigations, if you find any deficiencies, right, in the legal and regulatory compliances, what will you do? In that case, you should punish the concerned company, right, for not following the given norms and putting everyone in danger, right? So you will pursue levying of penalty and prosecution against the company for procedural lapses, right? These can also be regulatory lapses. So you have to punish the particular company for not following these norms in this particular case. If the legal and regulatory compliances are in place at the time of setting up of the additional unit, then you need to see what has happened over the period of last 10 years when the additional unit was in operation. So you can take this particular view of forming a committee to look into the operations of the enterprise for the last 10 years. Okay. So the committee will be mandated to conduct an impartial inquiry into the operations of the corporate house. So, how does the suggestion of forming a committee come into the picture? If you have read the newspapers, usually whenever something big happens, a committee is formed to undertake an investigation or an impartial inquiry into the happening of the event, right? So, as you read in the newspapers, so that is the first step that is taken, and you appoint impartial people who form part of the particular committee. You appoint some experts who have the capability to look into the matter, right? So this is something that you can use in your case studies. Moving on. So what will be the mandate of the committee? The committee should be required to make a report on the workings of the unit in a time bound manner. So to take necessary action, you want that the committee submits a report in a limited time frame. It should not take 5 years, 7 years, and till that time, what will happen to the industrial unit? The losses will be mounting, and what happens to all the penalty provisions that are there? If they're not implemented, there is going to be no effect, right? So the committee should be required to make a report in a time bound manner. Next, you will see what are you going to do. Next, whatever you do will depend on the report of the committee, right? So if the report of the committee shows any unlawful activities, for instance, not following proper waste disposal or contravention of environmental rules, regulations and norms, you will initiate proceedings for levy of penalty on the corporate house. However, if the report of the committee shows no wrongdoing and everything is fine, everything is bona fide, you will mandate the committee to find out the source of pollution for which the protests happened. Maybe the source of pollution was something else and the company is being targeted, right? So you never know. So if the report of the committee shows that everything is fine with the operations of the this particular additional unit, you should task the committee with finding out what exactly happened there, right? So if the source of pollution is something else, then you will initiate rectification of that particular thing, right? Next, if the source of pollution is the corporate house's operations itself, but it was inadvertent, as in the company did not do it deliberately, you will issue a warning to the corporate house and issue an order asking them to undertake a technical investigation into the causes and lapses, right? So in this case, the corporate house itself is not aware that its operations has caused such a huge um, polluting effect on the environment, right? So you ask the corporate house itself to undertake an investigation and to see uh, what are the shortcomings or what are the pitfalls in the process that led to this situation. So based on the results of the above, you ask them to rectify the causes and take stringent action to not repeat it. And finally, you will also issue an order requiring the corporate house to undertake restoration and reclamation activities for the water body, land and crops affected by its operations, right? So, since it is due to the corporate house's operations that this has happened, even though they did not deliberately do it, however, they will have to undertake restoration and reclamation activities, right? Because it is their actions that has caused this damage to the environment. So you would have read about these terms, restoration and reclamation activities, while preparing for GS3. So these are some keywords which you can use in your ethics case studies as well. Next, the health problems caused to humans and animals, which is mentioned, living nearby the additional unit, will also be investigated, and cost of medical treatment will be borne by the corporate house if possible, right? So this has been mentioned. This is a major cause of why the protests are happening, and the problem is that usually the people living nearby these units, industrial units, are not well to do, so their cost of medical treatment is huge and they bear a lot of financial impacts and psychological impacts as well. So if the corporate house can take that and can pay for this, then it will be a kind of penalty for them, and it will be relief or compensation for the people who are affected. Right, so coming to the agitation, I will order an inquiry into the proceedings of the agitation and how and why it became a law and order problem. Any agitation, if carried out peacefully, will not be a problem. The only point is that it became a law and order issue. And because of this, the state government had to close down the factory. So that is not lawful. You cannot become a law and order issue, right? So based on the findings, the persons responsible for violating law and order and resorting to violence and damage to public property should be penalized. They should know that it is the public infrastructure paid for by the taxpayers' money which they are damaging, and they are going to be held liable for the ramifications, right? So this is another step that you should take based on the entire situation. It does not mean that if you are aggrieved, you can do anything or whatever you want. You have to be lawful. You have to show your protest in a legal and peaceful manner, right? So if the corporate house is willing to modify its mode of operations and take corrective actions and follow stringent protocols of oversight and review of its operations by regulatory agencies, so these are certain steps. If the corporate house is willing to take, you can request for reopening of the factory or of the adjacent unit with modified processes or relocation of factory to a location where the land is degraded, right? So because there have been second order effects, so what are second order effects? The first order effect is that the additional unit has polluted the surrounding areas. The second order effect is that because of closure of the factory due to the protest, a lot of people have been unemployed, right? So unemployment at such a large scale is a huge social issue. It can lead to social unrest, right? because it's the livelihood of these people and their bread and butter that is at risk. Okay, so you should find out some possibility of making the things work out. So if the corporate house modifies its operations or take corrective actions and follow stringent protocols of oversight to see that nothing wrong is again happening, and review its operations and get it done by regulatory agencies, you can request for reopening with modified processes, or maybe relocation of the factory to a location where land is degraded and the environmental impact will be minimal, right? So as I mentioned, this is because of the second order consequences of a large number of people being unemployed due to factory closure. So this will be done after undertaking widespread public consultation and review with technological experts. So this is something that is usually done in an environmental impact assessment. You can easily use this point here in your case study answer, saying that widespread public consultation should be there so the public has confidence in the operations of the enterprise, and you need to review with technological experts, right, to take their view on whether what is being done is correct or not, to bring the public into confidence about the modified processes, right? So finally, as you see in the particular case study, it is also mentioned that there are other industries which are dependent on the chemicals manufactured by the corporate house which have been affected. Okay, so you can also call for a meeting with these industries to find out if they can arrange for alternate sources of supply in the short term. So now, as a senior officer dealing with the entire situation, you are not only responsible for addressing this particular company's problems or situation or the public's problems, but you are also concerned with what is happening in the other industries. It impacts the development of the country as a whole. It impacts those industries and employment, right? So if possible, can you help these industries arrange some alternate sources of supply in the short term? Maybe they can import it from somewhere, from some other country, or maybe they can get it from a different company in the country or a different factory of the same corporate house, right? So you can help them find out a solution in the short term. In the long term, once the factory is reopened with modifications or relocated, these industries can figure out a way to deal with the harmful byproducts and submit a report to record the measures that are being taken, right? In the long term, maybe they can also think of other alternatives for the chemicals that are being used that are so harmful for the environment, right? Apart from this, what can you do so that such a situation does not happen again in the future? So I will institutionalize an additional environment and social audit regularly every quarter. So this kind of audit will help to catch any deviations from the processes in the short term and ensure that the particular problem does not snowball into such a huge problem later on, right? So finally, based on the results of the audit, a follow-up environmental and social impact assessment can be undertaken every 4 years to account for any unexpected externalities. So after the entire process is set up, you do an environment and social audit every quarter for maybe 1 year or so. And then if the results are fine, you can undertake a follow-up audit every 4 years or every 3 years. It completely depends on how you want to go about it, right? Finally, so now we have sorted out this problem in the medium term, long term as well. But what are the extra steps that you can take, right? So you can try to find out international best practices being undertaken in the industry and help the corporate house to adopt the same, right? So if you see, for instance, in fossil fuel based vehicles, as of now, petrol, diesel, the government has taken the initiative to introduce CNG, to introduce electric and hybrid vehicles, so that the environmental impacts are reduced, right? So the government is giving incentives to the companies to adopt the particular technologies. Here also, the international best practices can be adopted by the companies if the government gives a few incentives, right? So you can take a few steps in that direction as well, and you will ask the corporate house to undertake further research on new technology which can be environmentally sustainable in the production process and implement it in its operations, right? So if you see, uh, these are the points that we can write in this particular case study. So I have taken each and every point that is mentioned in the case study and brainstormed about solutions for the same. Okay, so for unemployment, I will be doing this. For other industries being impacted, I will do this. For the additional unit which is polluting the area, I will undertake an inquiry and try to modify and rectify the processes so that it's environmentally sustainable. For the underprivileged who are facing health issues because of this environmental pollution, I will do this. So basically the points that are being generated over here are a result of brainstorming on each and every problem, each and every point mentioned in the case study, right? So in solving a particular case study, it is nothing but picking up the problems and finding out the solutions for the same. Okay, so now we move on to the next slide. Right, so we will see a few useful keywords for environmental issues based case studies, right? So one of the keywords that you can use is information and education campaign. Basically, to create awareness, you have some awareness campaigns on in which you distribute or disseminate information and try to educate the public or the particular targeted population on what are the impacts of a particular environmental issue, right? Population sensitization, this keyword can be used where you sensitize the people of the impact that their actions are having on the environment. For instance, um recycling products is something that you have to sensitize the population to do that. They might not be aware that them not recycling particular products is leading to environmental hazards, right? So you can mention this, that population has to be sensitized about the impacts of their actions. Internalization of negative externalities. Now this is another thing. So whenever a particular person or company is undertaking a particular project, all they think of is in terms of their interests, their advantages, disadvantages, their costs, their benefits, and their uh, problems, right? But their actions also might lead to some harm to the surrounding areas or the surrounding population or the surrounding biodiversity or ecosystem, right? So these are negative externalities caused due to their particular actions. So internalization of these externalities in the decision making process will help them to build more sustainable processes and undertake more environmentally sustainable projects and practices, right? So you can use this that this particular corporate house should internalize the problems or negative externalities being caused by their actions and try to rectify their processes or operations, right? Jan Andolan, you can use this word to say that, let's say, a community driven initiative is being undertaken for protecting the environment. So it is a Jan Andolan, right? Or community initiatives. Due diligence is that basically first you undertake a proper research and ensure that everything is going in the right direction before deciding something or embarking on a particular project. Greater good, I'm sure everyone is aware of what greater good means. Systemic changes, so you need to change the entire system and the incentives available at in the particular process or in the system, right? So these are systemic changes. Public scrutiny, that public should be able to point out deficiencies in the particular project because it impacts them. Impact on marginalized section, This is something which will be there in the environmental issues case studies a lot. People are displaced for setting up dams or construction projects, and so the impact on marginalized section has to be incorporated in the decision making. Disenfranchisement is basically stripping away the power of deciding for themselves or the power of taking decisions for themselves. So, any decision which leads to an impact on the target population without them having a say in it, without them being able to decide or modify the decision, is called disenfranchisement. Resettlement and rehabilitation is something that has to be done when the population is displaced from a particular area for a mega project. Then moral and legal sanctions. So basically, what are the moral values? What are the laws? What do the laws require you to do? So this is moral and legal sanctions on a particular action. Crisis of conscience is basically where you are not satisfied with the decision that you are taking and you are feeling guilty of any particular aspect of the decision. Some more useful keywords for environmental issues: spirit of rules and regulations. So sometimes the steps that corporates take to comply with rules and regulations are only on paper or are just a mere formality. They don't actually do things which are required to follow the rules and regulations in spirit or completely, like towards the objective that the rules and regulations were framed for, right? So you can use this keyword in that sense. Institutional capacity and authority. Let's say you have to do an environmental impact assessment. So do you have enough experts to carry that out, right? So that is your institutional capacity, and you have the power to scrutinize or to assess whether the project being carried out is being done in the right manner or not. So the power deals with whether you have the authority to do it or not. Then corporate governance norms, basically a lot of rules and regulations are have been laid down for corporates to follow, which includes corporate governance norms as well, which increases their accountability, transparency, compliance with legal norms, whether they're doing the right thing or not. So you can use this keyword. Then you have regulatory compliance mechanism. This is basically how you can comply with the regulations which have been laid down. For instance, whether a self-certification will do, or you need to get your premises reviewed by an independent team of experts, or do you need to get it audited every few months, right? So what is the regulatory compliance mechanism? How do you ensure that people are complying to the regulations which have been laid down? Environmental and social audit is basically audit by experts or by public representatives or by government functionaries to ensure that you are complying with the environmental and social rules, regulations, and norms. Environmental impact assessment, I'm sure everyone is clear about. Social impact assessment is basically a similar thing like environmental impact assessment, only the impact on the population living there or the ecosystem and biodiversity is checked in social impact assessment. Then you have information dissemination, basically distribution of information to various stakeholders. Public domain, basically here you can say that any particular issue should be discussed in the public domain to find out the wide ranging views and opinions on the issue at hand. International best practices, I'm sure every one of you understands what are international best practices. Short-sightedness. So one of the reasons why a lot of corporate houses or business houses do not follow environmental norms properly is that they believe that any side effects or any adverse effects will happen in the long term, And in the short term, there are not going to be many problems or hiccups along the way. They forget that this is also affecting their company's reputation of being an environmentally irresponsible company, or an irresponsible social stakeholder. So this is also one thing that they need to internalize in their decision making process, that such short sightedness of only caring about the short term effects and impacts of their decisions, and not about the long term effects and impacts and the intangible effects and impacts, is not actually healthy. Attitudinal change is something that all of us need to change our attitude towards environmental conservation and start treating it as not as something which is a luxury that if we have time or money we can do, but it's a necessity actually to save our planet from the adverse effects of climate change and global warming. Behavioral modification. So people have set habits and behaviors. So to incorporate any new environmentally sustainable practices, we need to change our behavior. So that is why behavioral modification is required. And moral responsibility, basically, one aspect of responsibility is the formal responsibility or accountability, that one person is responsible for something, right? Moral responsibility, however, anyone can take moral responsibility for a mistake of theirs, even though they don't really have to, they're not required to do that. For example, let's say one of your subordinates who is in your team makes a mistake. He is the one who is actually responsible for the mistake that he has made. However, you as a leader of the group can take moral responsibility for his mistake and bear the uh, punishment as well, right? So this is where you don't actually have to take the responsibility, but you are taking moral responsibility for it, right? Okay, so environmental ethos are basically environment related ethics, sustainable development, and protection of nature, conservation of water, not polluting the air, etc. These are environmental ethics. Sustainable development objectives, I'm sure every one of you knows what this means. Um, Environmental safeguards, basically, these are steps or measures which are undertaken to protect the environment from further harm. Second order effects we've already discussed in the previous case study. So, second order effects are basically an uh, second order effects basically mean that one event has happened whose effect is on some other stakeholder. So, the event primarily happened due to something else in a different situation, and the impact of that is on a different stakeholder, right? For example, when the factory was shut down, the employees got unemployed, right? The factory was shut down because of its polluting operations and because of no fault of the employees, right? But the employees were affected. Negative externalities are something like when a party which is completely unrelated to a particular situation, that party is suffering from what has happened, right? So industries which are dependent on the chemical produced by a particular company are affected in the last case study, even though they have no responsibility or anything related to what happened in the case of the company which was polluting the land, water, and crops, right? Impartial inquiry is straightforward. Corporate social responsibility, we've already discussed. Long-term costs and effects. So when you're dealing with environmental issues case studies, if you run out of points to write on the situation at hand, you can always use that I will do this to ensure that long-term effects are minimal. Like for instance, in the last case study, we mentioned that we will research on new technologies to include in the operations, to implement in operations so that it is less polluting later on, right? Environmental health, delicate ecosystem equilibrium. Delicate ecosystem equilibrium basically means that the equilibrium or the balance which is existing in the environment as of now is very fragile and very vulnerable to change. Even small changes can make very major differences or deviations in the way the environment functions, right? Survival of mankind, adverse impacts on health, and contamination of water bodies, land, etc. So this is something that you can mention in the case studies. Coming to case study number 2. So you are the managing director of Metro Rail Corporation of a metropolitan city, and you have received orders and funding for construction of the metro track and a parking space in a densely forested area of the city, which houses a few underprivileged families as well in it, right? For the construction, the forest has to be cleared and families have to be moved to some other place. The locals have started a protest after knowing about the order. They are highly raged about cutting down thousands of trees, and the affected families have also joined them because the forest holds emotional value for them. On the other hand, the minister who directly controls the MRC is pressuring you to start the felling process as soon as possible. You know that going against his orders will have serious repercussions, right? So, what are the ethical issues involved and the options available to you in such a situation? This is question number 1. And also suggest a course of action you would like to follow. This is question number 2. So, there are 2 questions in this particular case study. Which means that the entire case study is of 20 marks and you need to split the 2 into 10 marks each. In the first question, there are 2 things. What are the ethical issues involved and what are the options available to you in such a situation, right? So, you should again divide the 10 marks for this part into 2 parts, right? So, 5 points for the first part, 5 marks. What are the ethical issues involved, and 5 marks for the second part of the question, which is what are the options available to you. And part B of this question, suggest a course of action you would like to follow, is of 10 marks, right? Another thing to note here is that when they ask you to suggest a course of action you would like to follow, you don't just mention the course of action but also the reason behind why you are going to follow that particular course of action. Okay. So the analysis is this, that you are the managing director of Metro Rail Corporation. This should be very clear to you. Who are you in the particular case study? Because as an engineer, you will take a different stand. As a government servant, you will take a different stand. As a managing director, you will take a different stand. As a customer, you will take a different stand, right? So here you're the managing director. You have received orders and funding for construction of one metro track and a parking space. Where is this being constructed? It is in a densely forested area, so that is one problem of city with houses of few underprivileged families as well. This is the second problem. So there are vulnerable people as well who are living there. Then the forest has to be cleared and these families have to be moved. So the entire problem is that the forest is being cut down and the families will have to be resettled somewhere else. So the locals are protesting, and there is also a lot of rage about cutting down trees because the forest holds emotional value for these people. Finally, another problem is that the minister controlling Metro Rail Corporation is pressurizing you, and going against his orders will have serious repercussions for you, right? Okay, so now we move to what are the ethical issues involved. Okay, so the first thing that you can see is that the organizational interest is in executing the contract that has been signed. You have already received orders and funding to execute this metro rail project and build a parking space as well, right? You have already received it, and if you do not perform that, then your reputation is at stake, the company's performance is at stake, right? However, the public interest is that you don't dislocate the families and you don't cut down the trees. So this is one ethical issue where organizational interest is clashing with public interest. So that is the first thing that you identify in the case study. In the beginning itself it's mentioned that these are the issues. Next, development versus environment preservation. So the metro rail track project and parking space symbolizes development, whereas cutting of trees actually is kind of hampering environment preservation, right? So this can be one of the other ethical issues involved. Then what are the benefits of the particular decisions, right? So um, the benefit is that you will have connectivity to the public if you build the metro rail track, right? What are the disadvantages? That some underprivileged families will have to be resettled. Okay, so this can be another ethical issue which is involved. Now, next, moving on to you as the managing director who has to take the decision. What are your personal ethical issues? So one is personal ethics. Maybe you are very particular about environmental conservation. It is very close to your heart and you believe that you should be conserving the environment. But since you are a managing director of the organization, you have to take care of the organizational costs and benefits, right? As a managing director, your commitment to the organization is therefore coming into clash with your personal ethics. Fine. Next, accountability to the public. As a citizen of the country, you are a responsible citizen, right? And there has to be accountability to the public versus accountability to your superiors. The minister is your superior and he is trying to keep you accountable, and he is pressurizing you to begin the felling as soon as possible. And if you do not do that, he has mentioned that there will be serious repercussions, right? So these two dimensions of your accountability are clashing with each other. Okay, so moving on to what are the options available to you, right? So whenever a question asks what are the options available to you, there will be two extreme options. One will be completely good, one will be completely bad, or extremely right, extremely wrong. And there will be a middle path in between, right? So whenever the question asks options available to you, what you should ideally do is mention the particular option, write two, three merits and demerits of each option. So write three options available to you or four maximum. If the middle path options are distinct from each other, you can include four options, two extreme ones and two middle path. But you should also mention their merits and demerits, because options available to you, just listing down the options is not going to serve the purpose. What you have to do is analyze which option has which benefits, right? So one extreme option will be that you respect the public sentiments and scrap the project, right? So this is completely in favor of the public and completely not in favor of the organization. So the merits are that there will be environmental preservation and no effect on underprivileged. This is very easy to see. It's mentioned in the case study, right? Demerits, your career will be in jeopardy because serious repercussions have been highlighted by the minister already. Next, company performance might get negatively affected due to non-performance even after receipt of orders and funding, right? You're putting your company's reputation at stake. Second option is you ignore the protest and execute the project. Now, this is completely in favor of the company and completely against the public interest. So this is another extreme option. Merits are accountability to the minister is served and self-preservation. So your job is not affected. Company will not suffer due to non-performance of contract, right? However, the demerits are that the environment is getting damaged and there will be adverse effect on underprivileged due to their relocation, right? So basically in the two extreme options, your merits and demerits kind of interchange with each other, because in one extreme option you are favoring one party, in the other extreme option you're favoring the other party. Third option. So this is where you have to think a bit and come up with an option which meets the interests of all the stakeholders that are involved. So this is the main option which actually fetches you marks in the exam, because this is where you display your creativity and innovation and find out a solution which will be beneficial for all and lead to a win-win situation. So here I have thought about work out an alternative location for the project where the environment will be less affected and less impact on underprivileged families, right? So this is a good alternative, that you look for an area where there are not much trees and not much underprivileged families staying there, right? So merits will be environmental preservation, no effect on underprivileged. This is something that you can easily gauge from the case study, right? Company can execute the order and there will be no pressure from the minister. But demerits will be that you have to convince the public and the minister. Everyone is emotionally charged up and they want their interest to be taken care of. So this is going to be very difficult. There might be project and cost overruns, right? So because the project will be delayed, so there will be a lot of cost of money which is involved. Then finding out a new location is cumbersome. Now, in this alternative is also subject to the fact that you have to do a lot of hard work to find a new location. Okay, now second part of the question. So you say I will go for the third option, because basically why you're going for the third option, because it meets the uh, interest of everyone. It satisfies almost everyone, right? But you also have to ensure that you address the demerits of this option in this particular question, right? And how you will address the demerits, you need to mention that. Otherwise, your answer is going to be incomplete. So, um, this is how I have approached this particular answer. Maybe you can also pause the video for a bit and brainstorm on how you want to go ahead with this course of action sub part of the question. So the following are the steps that I will take to execute this option. First, unless and until you take your minister into confidence, he is not going to let you do anything. He'll just replace you, right? So that is the first place you go to. You will meet the minister and persuade him to pause the project, as stronger public backlash might hamper his reputation and put a question mark over his credibility, right? So you try to convince the minister and persuade him by highlighting that his interest might get affected if the public had a stronger resentment, right? And it is this point that the minister might heed. If you go to him and tell him that the environment is getting affected and underprivileged families are getting affected, he might not even care. But here, when you say that public backlash will hamper his reputation, then he will care about his interests, right? Secondly, it is not good for the reputation of Metro Rail Corporation as well to go against environmental ethics and social welfare, right? So any corporation, for instance, you would have read about Bhopal gas tragedy and how the particular company had to suffer so much because of what happened, right? So it is completely not good for MRC to have a negative image in the minds of the public, right? So that is another important thing which the minister might consider. Then third, after getting this done, you will then assure the public and protesting groups and pacify them that we will take their concerns into consideration and move forward with the project only when these are adequately addressed. So this will cool down the flaring tempers a bit, right? Okay, next what do you do? Now, once you have pacified everyone, you look at how to make the project work, right? So first you find out through an environmental impact assessment, what is the impact of the project on the environment? Whether people are actually fighting on something which is going to harm them, or are they just being emotionally charged, right? So what is the impact of the project on the environment? Then you try to change the location of the project to a degraded land if the environmental impact assessment shows adverse impact on the ecosystem, right? Apart from the forest being cut down, the other concern was about the underprivileged families living there. So for them, you can take a social impact assessment to see if alternative livelihood opportunities and residential area can be arranged for the few underprivileged families so that they face minimum disruption to their lives. Another thing to consider over here is that because of the coming of the metro rail project, maybe they get employment there itself, right? So you have to work out an alternative livelihood opportunity for them. Plus, because these underprivileged families have been living in the forest, they would be codependent with the forest. So how do you help them upskill or reskill so that they can begin their livelihood in a different area is also important. Plus, it holds emotional value for them. So all these aspects, psychological and mental impacts on them, everything has to be taken into account in the social impact assessment. Okay, so based on the results, I will finalize the same or a different location and call for a public meeting to announce the findings of the impact assessment and take their consultation. So you kind of put the results out in front of the public and discuss. So this is putting everything in the public domain so that public confidence is being built. Next, I will give my best effort to persuade the locals of the importance of execution of the project and highlight the benefits of better access to health institutions, educational institutions, and livelihood opportunities arising as a result of improved connectivity of their area. Another thing that you can add over here is that you can incorporate technologies which cause minimum felling down of trees and minimum disruption to the environment, right? So you can maybe pursue that aspect as well. In the meantime, I will keep the company who ordered this construction apprised of the development and keep the funds in an escrow account for complete transparency, right? So you've already received orders and you are accountable to that particular company as well. So don't forget that. This is one important point. So whenever you are doing a particular case study, underline whatever is happening. You have to respond to each and every point in the question that has been asked. So each and every point should be mentioned in the answer, right? Finally, once all proposed changes are made, I will expedite the project as much as possible in order to ensure that the company delivers on time. So we also mentioned that there will be project and cost overruns in the demerits. So this is one thing that you can do. You will expedite the project and keep the resources ready at hand so that the company can execute the project expeditiously. Okay, so now moving on to practice case study 1. So here you are a new employee at a manufacturing unit of an MNC. You have got this job with great difficulty as nearly 50 candidates appeared for the job interview. The salary is good and your family is really happy for your achievement. However, after working for a few days, you realize that some of the manufacturing processes in the unit are in gross violation of environmental norms and cause severe groundwater depletion. If the company does not adopt some measures, then its manufacturing costs would go up and the unit might have to be shut down. You are in a state of dilemma and unrest. Analyze the different options available with you and explain what action you will take in such a situation. Right? So this is a classic example of a case study where environment versus development versus companies operations is at stake. Plus you are also a new candidate with a new job, right? So please formulate your answer to this particular case study and you can get it evaluated by Sunya. Practice case study 2. Uh, Jyoti Gupta is the environmental compliance manager for a small plastics manufacturing company. She is currently faced with a dilemma on whether or not to spend money on a new technology that will reduce the level of a particular toxin in the wastewater that flows out from the back of the factory into a lake. The factory's emission levels are already within legal limits. However, Jyoti knows that environmental regulations for this particular toxin are lagging behind scientific evidence. So this is something Jyoti has come across proactively, right? In fact, a scientist from the university had been quoted in the newspaper recently saying that if emission levels stayed at this level, the fish in the lake and rivers in the area might soon have to be declared unsafe for human consumption. There's already discussion going on about this. Further, if companies in the region don't engage in some self-regulation on this issue, there is reason to fear that the government, backed by public opinion, may force companies to begin using the new technology and may also begin requiring monthly emission level reports, which would be both expensive and time consuming. But the company's environmental compliance budget is tight. Asking for this new technology to be installed would put Jyoti's department over budget and could jeopardize the company's ability to show a profit this year. right? So this is basically short-term versus long-term implications. The following are some suggested options. Please evaluate the merits and demerits of each of the options. Number one, Jyoti should focus on our company's financial performance and profits and forget the environmental issue as the compliance budget is already tight. Number two, as the emission levels of the company are within legal limits, Jyoti should wait for new governmental regulations first and only after that should think about taking any action. And number three, Jyoti should proactively report the matter to the higher management and ensure proper measures are taken, but still profits of the company should receive utmost priority. Also indicate, without necessarily restricting to the above options, what would you advise giving proper reasons, right? So this is another good case study which you should try practicing. Please attempt this case study and get it evaluated by Shunya's team so that you can also get a flavor of how to answer case studies in the UPSC mains ethics exam, right? That's all for environmental case studies. Hope you liked the video and it helped you and added some value to your preparation. Thank you and all the best.